She threw the document across the desk, and it hit him in the chest. "Read it," she said. Out loud. Every word. Right now. Julian didn't flinch. He picked the wool up from where it had fallen. He looked at her. Really looked at her, the first time since he'd entered the room, and what she saw in his face stopped her cold. Not guilt. Something worse than guilt. She already knew. "You knew about this clause," she said. The words came out barely above a whisper. "Before today. You knew." He said nothing. "My husband is 11 days dead," she said, her voice fracturing at the edges. "And you are standing in front of me holding a document that says, that if you so much as look at me the wrong way, I lose everything he left me." She pressed her hand flat against the desk to steady herself. "And you are not surprised? Not even a little?" Julian set the document down. "Marian." "How long?" she said. Silence. "How long have you been in love with me?" The clock on the wall marked 5 seconds. 10. And then Julian Voss, the most controlled man she had ever known, the man who had sat at her dinner table for 2 years and never once given himself away, closed his eyes. That was her answer. The clause was precise, unambiguous Victorian legal prose. In the event that the named executor, Lord Julian Voss, Duke of Ravenmore, shall engage in any romantic conduct, declaration, or formal pursuit of the widow of this estate, Lady Marian Ashford, during the period of executorship, all provisions of this will pertaining to Lady Ashford's inheritance shall be rendered void, and the entirety of the Whitmore estate shall pass to the named charitable trust. She set the document down. The room was very quiet. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not the controlled composure, not the warmth he occasionally allowed in private company. Something stripped. Something that had been underneath the composure the whole time and was now visible because he didn't have the wherewithal, in this moment, to cover it. She understood everything in approximately 3 seconds. "How long?" she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. It was the steadiness of a woman standing on ice that she knows is cracking beneath her. He said nothing. "Julian." The first time she had used his given name to his face. "How long have you felt this way?" The clock on the mantel ticked 4 times. "That," he said quietly, "is not a conversation we are in a position to have." She looked at the document between them. Then she looked at him. Then she sat back in her chair and felt the full, vertiginous weight of what her dead husband had constructed around her, around both of them. And the feeling was not grief and not rage and not love and somehow, impossibly, was all 3 at once. If you have ever loved someone you were not allowed to have, stay. Because this story is about to show you exactly what that costs. Comment below. Subscribe if stories like this reach you where you live. Act 1. The Will. Edward Ashford had been a good man. Marian believed this without reservation, even now, even sitting in a solicitor's office with a document in front of her that was rewriting everything she thought she understood about her marriage. He had been warm, reliable, thoughtful in the particular unhurried way of men who have decided that paying attention to other people is the most useful thing a person can do with their time. He had loved her, genuinely, demonstrably, in the daily language of consideration that Marian had come to value far above the grand gestures of courtship. He had been a good husband. He had also, apparently, known something she did not, and done something with that knowledge that she was only now beginning to understand. The executorship had been arranged before his illness. Julian Voss had accepted it the previous year, during one of those conversations between old friends that seem administrative and are, in retrospect, something else entirely. Edward had asked. Julian had agreed. Marian had not been party to the discussion. She thought about that now, sitting in her drawing room that evening with the copy of the will in her lap, a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her. She thought about what it meant that Edward had chosen Julian specifically, that he had written the clause specifically, that he had left no note, no letter, no explanation, only the document, with its clean, devastating precision. Edward Ashford had not been a careless man. He did not do things without reason. which meant the clause had a reason. She simply did not know what it was. Julian Voss drove home from the solicitor's office in the particular silence of a man who has been dreading something for a long time and has now arrived at the thing he was dreading and discovered it is exactly as bad as he feared, plus one additional thing he had not anticipated. The additional thing was this. She had asked how long. Not what is this? Not what did Edward mean? She had looked at him across a desk and asked how long, which was the question a person asks only when they have already understood the answer to every preceding question and are moving straight to the center of it. She knew. She had always known, or close enough to always, that the distinction was academic. He had loved Marian Ashford for 2 years. He had loved her since the third time he'd come to dinner at the Whitmore house. A Tuesday in October of 1879, when she had been arguing with Edward about the historical accuracy of something in a novel she was reading, and Edward had turned to Julian and said, "Settle this." And Julian had looked at her face, animated, certain, completely uninterested in performing correctness for anyone's benefit, and felt something shift in him that he'd spent the subsequent 24 months trying to put back where it came from. He had not acted on it. Not by word, not by gesture, not by anything except the most careful and disciplined management of his own internal landscape, which he had undertaken with the grim precision of a man who understands exactly what is at stake. Edward was his closest friend. Marian was Edward's wife. These were not ambiguous facts. He had told himself this every day for 2 years. He had believed it every day for 2 years. And now Edward was dead at 34. The heart, sudden, no warning, the kind of death that arrives without the courtesy of preparation. And the will was read, and Julian was the executor, and Marian was sitting in a drawing room somewhere in Mayfair with a document in her lap and a question he hadn't answered. He got home. He went to his study. He sat at his desk. On the desk, in a drawer he had not opened in 8 months, was a letter he had written on a Thursday evening in February of the previous year. He had written it because there are nights when the thing you cannot say builds to a pressure that demands some outlet, and the outlet he had chosen was paper, knowing he would never send it. It was 3 pages long. It said everything. It was addressed to no one. He had forgotten it was there. He opened the drawer now, looked at the letter, and closed the drawer again. He could not afford to think about that letter. Act 2, what the clause says. The executorship required meetings. This was simply the mechanical reality of managing an estate of Whitmore's complexity, properties to assess, investments to review, staff arrangements to confirm, legal documents to process. Julian had understood this when he accepted. He had understood it in the abstract, theoretical way of a man who accepts a duty before he knows the full shape of what it will cost him. The meetings happened in the Whitmore drawing room, twice weekly, on Tuesday and Friday mornings. Marian would be present. They would sit on opposite sides of the writing table near the window, the same table where she and Edward had eaten breakfast on Sundays, the same table at which she had written letters every afternoon for 3 years, a table that was now strewn with estate documents that neither of them looked at more than strictly necessary. The first meeting was the week after the will reading. Marian poured tea with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who has decided that the management of ordinary things is the only reliable defense against the management of extraordinary ones. Julian discussed the Eastern property valuation. She asked 3 precise questions. He answered them. She took notes. He reviewed the investment portfolio. She had already read it. She corrected an arithmetic error on page 4. At no point did either of them refer to the clause. At no point were they unaware of it. This was the shape of the first 3 weeks. Professional, correct, conducted with the focused attention of 2 highly intelligent people who have agreed, without negotiation, to keep an enormous thing in the room without naming it. They were very good at it. It cost them everything. It was the 3rd Friday that Marian said, setting down her pen at the end of an hour's review, "I want to understand the terms precisely." Julian looked up. "The clause," she said. "Marian, I am not asking you to discuss your feelings," she said. I am asking you to clarify legal language. What constitutes romantic conduct under the terms of the will? What the enforcement mechanism is? Who, if anyone, would be in a position to challenge the provision? He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze with the patient, direct quality that he had first noticed at a dinner table in October of 1879 and had never been able to fully account for. The way she looked at a thing she needed to understand, as though she had all the time in the world and intended to use it. Any declaration of feeling, he said carefully. Any conduct that a court would classify as romantic pursuit. The provision is enforceable by the charitable trust named as alternate beneficiary. They have both motive and legal standing. And the executorship itself? She asked. How long does it last? 18 months from the date of probate, he said. She wrote something on the page in front of her. He could not see what. And after 18 months, she said. The clause expires with the executorship, he said. She looked at what she had written. She folded the paper in half. She put it in her pocket. Thank you, she said. Shall we continue with the tenant review? They continued with the tenant review. Act 3, Proximity. The meetings continued. What changed, imperceptibly at first, and then with a momentum that had its own weather, was the quality of the silence between subjects. Marian began asking questions that were not strictly necessary, not flirtatious, nothing so crude as that, and nothing that could be cited in any legal document as romantic conduct, but questions that stepped outside the perimeter of the estate review and into the territory of, what do you think of this? Did Edward ever tell you about? What did you make of him, truly, at the end? Questions that required Julian to be present as a person rather than as an executor. Questions that required, in answering, a kind of intimacy that was its own slow and perfectly calibrated pressure. He answered them. He answered them because he was not capable of refusing her honesty when she was asking him directly, and because the answers were, in the particular loneliness of grief, in the way that loss opens a space in a person that only honesty can begin to fill, the most meaningful conversations he had had in months. He also knew exactly what she was doing. He did not say so. She also knew he knew. She did not stop. The unsent letter appeared on a Tuesday in late April. Julian had been reviewing a document at the writing table and had set a book on the edge of the desk, one of his own, left from a previous visit, which he'd been meaning to retrieve. When Marian picked it up to move it, an envelope fell from between the pages. She did not mean to look at it. She glanced at it the way you glance at any object that lands near you, and then she stopped. It was sealed, unaddressed. In Julian's handwriting, she had become familiar with his hand across 3 months of estate documents, the particular way he formed his capital letters, the slight leftward lean. The envelope was not new. The paper had the color of something that had been sitting undisturbed for some time. She placed it on the desk between them. This fell from the book, she said. He looked at it. Something in his face went very still. He reached for it. She put 2 fingers on the envelope before he could take it. Not aggressively. With the precise, measured gesture of a woman who is asking a question without words. He met her eyes. When was this written? She asked. He said nothing. The paper, she said. It isn't new. This was written months ago. A pause. Before Edward died. The clock ticked. Outside, a carriage passed in the street. In the room, 2 people sat on opposite sides of a table with an envelope between them and a 1.5 years of accumulated restraint pressing on every surface like weather before a storm. Give me that, he said. Quietly. Not a demand. More like the request of a man who is watching something slip toward a precipice and cannot catch it. Tell me what it says, she said. Marian. Tell me, she said, what it says, and I will give it back to you. And we will never speak of it again if that is what you want. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her hand on it. He looked at her face. It says, he said, after a long moment, everything that I have spent 2 years not saying. The room was entirely quiet. She withdrew her hand. He took the envelope. He put it in his coat. She turned back to the estate documents. The Hartley tenancy, she said. Her voice was even. Her hands, under the table, were not. He picked up his pen. Yes, he said. The Hartley tenancy. They worked for another hour without speaking of anything else. But when she walked him to the front door that evening, a formality she had begun 3 weeks ago, not for any reason she could have named to a solicitor, and he stepped out onto the pavement, he stopped with his back to her and said, very quietly, "The same week Edward changed the will." She stood in the doorway. "What?" "The letter. You were going to ask when it was dated." He did not turn around. It was the same week Edward changed the will. A beat of silence long enough to hold a year's worth of questions. He walked to the carriage. He did not look back. She stood in the doorway with the evening air against her face and felt the world rearrange itself around a single sentence. She did not sleep. She lay in the bedroom that had been hers and Edward's and stared at the plasterwork on the ceiling and turned the sentence over and over the way you work a splinter, not to inflict pain, but because the body cannot leave it alone until it understands the shape of the thing. The same week Edward changed the will, which meant Edward had found the letter, or known about the letter, or known about Julian, about whatever Julian had been carrying, in some way that had caused him to open the will document and add a clause that no sane solicitor would have suggested on their own. Edward had known. She thought about this for a very long time. She thought about what Edward knowing would mean about the 3 years of their marriage, and what it would mean about Julian's 2 years of perfect, painful distance, and what it would mean about the clause, whether it was a punishment or something else entirely, something she did not yet have the right word for. She thought about the morning Edward died. She thought about his face. She thought about whether, in retrospect, there was something in it she had not allowed herself to read. She did not find an answer. She found more questions, which she collected like stones and put in her pockets, and carried them to Tuesday's meeting. She waited until the estate business was complete. She waited until Julian had closed the folder and capped the ink and had the particular quality of stillness that meant he was preparing to leave. Then she said, "Did Edward know?" Julian became very still. "About the letter," she said. "About whatever was in it." "Did he know?" Across the table, Julian sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled composure and not the stripped vulnerability of the will reading, but something in between. The face of a man who has been holding the truth in his hands for a long time and has arrived at the moment where continuing to hold it is no longer possible. "Yes," he said. The word was quiet and exact and fell into the room with the weight of everything it confirmed. "How?" she asked. "I told him," Julian said. She stared at him. "You," she stopped. Began again. "You told your closest friend that you were in love with his wife." "I told my closest friend," Julian said, with the careful precision of a man recounting something that cost him considerably, "that I had developed feelings I had no intention of acting on, that I was managing them, and that he deserved to know because I was not willing to be in his house under false pretenses." A pause. "It was the hardest conversation of my life. When, February of last year," he said, "the same evening I wrote that letter. I wrote the letter first because I needed to understand what I was going to say. Then I went to his club and I said it. Marian sat with this. February of last year. 7 months before Edward died. 7 months of Edward knowing, and Edward continuing to invite Julian to dinner, and Edward treating him with the same warmth and friendship as always, and Edward, silently, without explanation, going to his solicitor and adding a clause to his will. "What did he say?" she asked. "When you told him?" Julian looked at the desk. "He was quiet for a long time," he said. "Then he asked me if I had spoken to you. I said no. He asked if I intended to. I said no, never. He said." Julian stopped. "What did he say?" she said. Very quietly. "He said he believed me," Julian said. "And then he ordered another drink and asked me what I thought of the new conservative bill, and we did not speak of it again. Not once. In the 7 months before he died. The fire in the grate had burned low. Outside, the afternoon had shifted toward evening. The drawing room was the particular gold of late light through net curtains, The color of a world going on normally outside a room where nothing was normal at all. He wrote the clause after that conversation, she said. Yes. And he left no explanation. None. She looked at the empty fireplace. She looked at the mantel, where a photograph of Edward stood in a silver frame. Edward at 32, smiling at whoever was behind the camera, easy and warm in the way he always was. She had not moved the photograph. She had not moved anything. Was it a punishment? She said. She was not asking Julian. She was asking the room, or the photograph, or the version of her husband who had sat at a solicitor's desk and constructed this with his own hand. I don't know, Julian said. Or was it? She stopped. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. I cannot work out what he intended. Neither can I, he said. He loved you, she said. He loved you as much as he loved anyone outside of family. He spent 7 months knowing what you had told him, and he didn't pull away from you. He didn't change. He invited you to our dinner table in March and April and June, the same as always. Yes, Julian said. That is not how a man behaves when he is punishing someone, she said. Julian looked at her. No, he said carefully. It is not. The thought in the room, unspoken, barely formed, the size of something beginning, was too large for either of them to name yet. They both felt it. They both left it alone. I need to think, she said. I know, he said. Come on Friday, she said. We'll finish the Hartley review. Yes, he said. He left. She sat alone in the golden room with the photograph of her husband and the particular feeling of a woman who is standing at the edge of a truth she is not yet ready to step into, but who can see it clearly from where she stands, and knows it is there, and knows she will have to cross to it eventually. The solicitor's name was Mr. Clement Briggs, and he arrived on a Thursday morning in May with a new piece of information that altered the architecture of everything. The executorship, he explained, apologizing for the fact that this had not been made clear at the original reading, was to be concluded within a fixed term. The 18 months began from the date of probate confirmation, which had come through that week, which meant the executorship, and by extension the clause, would expire in precisely 30 days. Julian received this information standing in the hallway of the Whitmore house, with Marian 3 feet away and Briggs entirely unaware of what he was detonating. I see, Julian said. Thank you, Briggs. Briggs left. The hallway was quiet. Marian and Julian stood in it without speaking for a long time. 30 days. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them was everything. The 2 years of suppression, the letter, the clause, the conversation with Edward, the unanswered question of whether the dead man had meant this as a wall or a doorway. All of it, visible and present, in the narrow space between 2 people standing in a hallway in the middle of May. 30 days, she said. Yes, he said. She nodded. She turned and walked back to the drawing room. He followed. They sat down. They opened the Hartley tenancy file. Neither of them mentioned it again. Not that day, not the following Tuesday, not across all the strange and suspended days that followed, during which the air in the Whitmore drawing room had the particular quality of a room in which something enormous is being held very deliberately in place. They were both aware, every day, of the number. She counted without meaning to. He counted without wanting to. And the counting gave each meeting a weight that made it hard to breathe, not because anything was said, but because nothing was, and the nothing pressed on every surface like the weight of water above a diver who has gone very deep. He brought her the completed estate documents on day 14. She signed them at the writing table with the careful, unhurried hand she brought to everything, and when she pushed them back across to him, her fingers brushed his hand. Not an accident, not entirely deliberate. The kind of thing that happens in the space between intention and restraint when the distance between them has become too small. He did not move his hand immediately. 1 second. 2. Then he took the documents. They looked at each other. Julian, she said. Don't, he said. Very quietly. Not harshly. With the voice of a man talking himself back from the edge of something. Please don't. I wasn't going to say anything improper, she said. I know, he said. I know you weren't. But I need, he stopped. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. I need the 30 days to mean something. Not because the clause says so. Because Edward trusted me. He trusted me with everything he left behind, including you. And I will not make myself into a man who uses the last 30 days of a legal restriction as a runway. She held his gaze for a long moment. You are, she said quietly, the most honorable and most infuriating man I have ever known. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile. I am aware those are not mutually exclusive. She looked away. Outside, London went about its afternoon. 16 days, she said. Yes, he said. They went back to work. Day 29. She was alone in the drawing room when the letter arrived. The footman brought it on a small silver tray. No stamp, no postmark, because it had not come through the post. It had been held by Briggs's office under sealed instruction to be delivered at this specific date. It was in Edward's handwriting. She sat with it for a long time without opening it. She turned it in her hands. She looked at the seal, plain red wax, no crest, the seal of a private letter rather than an official one. She thought about the man who had written it, and when, and in what state of mind, and what he could possibly have left to say that the will had not already said. Then she broke the seal. She read it standing, because she had risen without realizing it when she picked up the letter, and by the time she finished the first page, she could not have sat down if she'd tried. She read all 3 pages. When she finished, she stood in the middle of the drawing room with the letter in both hands and felt her face do something it had not done since the day Edward died. Not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but the specific, unclassifiable emotion of having been given something back that you did not know had been taken from you. The clock on the mantel read 4:15. She folded the letter and looked at her with the expression she had last seen at the will reading, when the composure had briefly failed and something underneath it had looked out. Marian, he said. I brought you something, she said. She crossed to him and held out the letter. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. He read it standing, the way she had, standing in the doorway of his own morning room with 3 pages of his dead friend's handwriting, and she watched his face as he read it, and she watched what happened to his face on the second page. He did not make a sound. He was, as always, controlled. But she saw it. What Edward had written was this. He had written that he knew. He had always known, not from Julian's confession, but from before it, from the way a man who loves his wife pays attention to the people around her, and from the way Julian Voss had been paying attention to Marian since the autumn of 1879 in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary friendship and everything to do with a man trying, honorably and unsuccessfully, not to feel what he felt. He had written that he had not been angry. This was the thing. This was the sentence Marian had read 3 times before she could absorb it. I was not angry. I want you to know that first, before anything else. I was not angry. He had written that love was not a finite thing, not a competition, not something that diminished by being present in more than one place. He had loved Marian completely. He had loved Julian as a brother. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and he had spent the last year of his life sitting with them both and finding, to his own surprise, that they were not in conflict. He had written that the clause was not a punishment. It was not retribution, not a wall, not a permanent barrier placed between 2 people to mark his territory from beyond the grave. He was not that kind of man and had not wanted to become that kind of man in death. The clause was time. Simply time. He had known he was dying. The heart, the doctor had told him, was not reliable, could go at any moment, had been living on borrowed seasons. He had known, and he had thought, if I go, Marian will grieve, and grief is not a state in which a person can choose freely. And Julian will grieve, and guilt is not a state in which a person can act honestly. They will need time. Time that, left to themselves, they will not take, because they are both people who put others first until it costs them everything. So he had built the time into the document. He had made it legal. He had given them 30 days of neither together nor apart, and then a day 31 on which both of them would arrive clear of the fog of loss, clear of the immediacy of his absence, clear enough to look at each other and see what was actually there. He had not told them this. He had not explained it in the will, because an explanation would have made it a gift, and a gift creates obligation, and obligation was the last thing he wanted between them. He had wanted it to be a choice, entirely theirs, with no fingerprints. The letter closed. If you are reading this, Marian, then you found your way through. I am glad. I want you to be glad too. Not eventually. Now, tell him I said so. Julian finished reading on the 3rd page. He stood in the doorway with the letter in his hands and his face doing the thing it only did when he had no resources left to manage it. Open, unguarded, entirely human. He looked at her. She was watching him with those clear, direct eyes, the eyes he had first really looked at across a dinner table in October of 1879 and had not been able to stop looking at since. He says to tell you, she said, that he wants you to be glad. Julian said nothing. He looked at the letter. He looked back at her. Not eventually, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, Edward always did have impeccable timing. She almost smiled. It was the first real smile, unguarded, involuntary, that he had seen from her in months, and it hit him with the force of something he had been bracing against for 2 years and was only now, standing in a morning room doorway on a Tuesday in June, permitted to stop bracing against. She crossed to him. She stopped close, closer than the drawing room table, closer than the solicitor's office, closer than every carefully managed proximity of the last 18 months. She looked up at him. You are going to have to stop composing yourself, she said. I know, he said. And you are going to have to stop being so extraordinarily correct about everything. I know that too, he said. Because I am tired, she said, of being the only one in the room who is willing to be honest about what is happening. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, very slowly, with the deliberate care of a man doing something he has thought about and not done for a very long time, he raised his hand and touched her face. One hand against her cheek. Nothing more. She closed her eyes. Tell me what you want, he said, quietly. Not a romantic line. An honest question, the kind he should have been allowed to ask 2 years ago and was asking now, in the only way it could properly be asked, freely, without clause, without constraint, without the weight of a dead man's estate between them. She opened her eyes. I want, she said, to come inside. And I want you to close the door. He stepped back from the doorway. She crossed the threshold. He closed the door. Outside, London went on in all its ordinary noise and life. Carriages, coal smoke, a newspaper boy on the corner, the bright and indifferent machinery of a city that did not know and did not need to know what had just been decided in a morning room in Mayfair. Inside, there was nothing dramatic, nothing announced, no performance for any audience.